Irving Memoir was my neighbor ever since he died in 1982. And he lived here in this house for 50 years, but before he and his wife, Hazel, moved here, they had done lots of traveling and stuff. He painted with other famous artists. I don't know if you can see it, but he built the side of his house over there and right here. He'd make, in his backyard, he'd make little tiles to put on them, and he'd actually kind of bake them out of a little kiln in his backyard. It was kind of weird. I guess I've known him ever since I was a little baby, because they never really had any kids, so I was kind of like their granddaughter, and my parents kind of, brought me over, and I was little. I don't really remember him, but I remember his wife. He never really seemed exceedingly happy. I remember that. He was kind of protective over his house and his property. I saw one of his paintings in a museum over in Laguna. I'm not sure what kind of art he did, but I've seen a couple abstract paintings of his, and he liked to work with tiles, such as his house.
This is a story about artists who, as outsiders, wherever they live, yield fresh and at times idiosyncratic ideas. It is a story about suburban isolates who have not only survived, but have actually flourished in a climate of sunshine, freedom, and isolation from the mainstream. First, let us look at the dynamic changes that created Southern California from the early teens through the 30s. Sprawling urban development and automobiles that permitted the free-flowing movement of people and ideas. The lure of the Hollywood film industry that employed hundreds of artists as scenic designers and painters. Sunshine and a beautiful coastal place to escape to were a never-ending source of creative inspiration. In this new and boundaryless landscape, artists and intellects felt free to express themselves and borrow from any historical art style that they chose. Testimony to this is most conspicuous in the diverse and often contradictory architectural styles that exist side by side in Southern California. Artists and writers attracted to the dramatic landscape, canyons, and rocky shores of the Pacific began to visit and often settle in the Laguna Beach area in the late 1800s. Irving Memoir was a Chicago artist who in 1924 was commissioned with a group of artists to travel to Taos, New Mexico in order to make art for prominent Chicago collectors. From Taos, Memoir and his wife Hazel traveled to Laguna Beach, where they stayed at a studio belonging to a Margarita Orlova in the Laguna Canyon. There he painted many canvases of the area and donated 2 of them to the fledgling Laguna Art Museum before returning to Chicago. In 1918, in Laguna Beach, an association of artists who wanted a place to show and sell their artwork formed the Laguna Art Association. It was the first social organization in Laguna Beach and became an important center for both social and cultural activities. Its earliest members were practitioners of a style called California Impressionism, which evolved out of European Impressionism as early as the late 1800s in Laguna Beach. Soon thereafter, artists started to paint daily life in California and formed what became known as the California School. This was the first indigenous art movement in California and was embraced by artists who visited and settled in this area in order to capture the essence of its life and nature. David Starry Sheets son of Millard Sheets, the most noted of the California school painters, talks about those early days.
David, what were the art movements that were occurring in this region during the 30s and 40s?
Well, it was an amazing time. We had, of course, the establishment of the California Impressionist movement. These artists had been painting here for 30 years and continued to paint into the 50s, basically, in their manner. But coming into existence was a whole new group of artists. Well, there were really two basic movements happening. You had your American scene movement, which was divided into two basic groups. You had your regionalist painters, and regionalism was a national type of movement, but by being regional, each area in the country had its own group of artists that were doing their own development and style. You had your you had your social realists, who were people who were depicting the bad side of things very, very strongly and adroitly. You also had the beginning of the modernist movement, which was more still stimulated by the European influence and not as much an American style. So you had all of these things happening simultaneously by the 1930s in Southern California, and there was a lot of interplay between these various schools of thought.
Was there competition, or was there interplay?
No, it was really more of an interplay. There was competition, certainly. Everybody in life is looking for their own place in the sun. But there was a strong interrelationship of people like, well, when we speak of regionalists, we speak of Millard Sheets and Phil Dike and Phil Paradise and Rex Brandt coming along and Emil Cosa and George Gibson, a whole group of artists that in Southern California were showing together. They were very much interested in watercolor as a medium and brought watercolor to new heights in the American standard of painting. They showed through the California Watercolor Society, which ultimately started producing shows in New York, in Philadelphia, and Chicago, and so on. So they took what they knew to other parts of the country.
Can you talk a little bit about Rex Brandt and his school in Corona Del Mar? That was quite influential for that
came
time.
a little later, but it had a tremendous importance in what Rex and Phil Dike together. It was Rex Brandt and Phil Dike started a school in Corona Del Mar in the late 40s. And that school flourished. It was a summer-type program that flourished all the way up into the early 70s.
Well, what happened in the 40s? We're talking about that after World War II.
In the 1940s, the results of the war were that these regionalist painters in California suddenly had a much broader view of the world, which was important. They became, their art interest became more than just their local region. And at the same time, the war prompted very strongly the sort of jet propulsion of the modernist movement. Abstract expressionism and so on became the main interests of the curators and the critics. And this art became the cutting edge, was more important in their view than the traditional art of the earlier approach. Or
so how did that affect these artists in this region?
There was a lot of effect. Some of it positive and some of it not so positive. A number of the more traditional artists, those who were the regionalists and the realists, they found themselves somewhat stranded without a voice, without the herald that they had been accustomed to in the 30s and the early 40s. And so there was a sense of depression that set in with a lot of them. A lot of them were teachers, so they never really were out of the mainstream. They had to adopt some of their thinking to these new approaches, the more acceptable approaches.
Had to or wanted to?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a matter of survival, so a lot of them felt they had to. Some of them felt they wanted to, and then there were those who basically maintained their own approach and never did really change. Artists, I want to retract just a little bit on that, because one of the things I think is unique about the California school painters, people like Sheets and Dyke and Brandt and Cosa, these are the people that I'm personally involved with and know quite well. These artists were never trendy. They were never into a situation where they painted to sell paintings. They painted because they had to. It was an internal pressure that they had to express themselves, and it was personal. It wasn't a situation of just doing commercial art. Now, they all had the capacity to do that. They could do commercial art and make a good living at it. But in their fine art, in their real paintings, they were able also to maintain their own personal sense. And through that, they also had a personal drive to improve, to grow, to find new answers. And so when things like the modernist movement is getting its foothold and really taking over in the world, these guys looked at what was happening, and they incorporated ideas into their work, and they did study it, and they understood it. They understood the theories behind abstract expressionism, and in the 1950s and 60s, you can see a lot of their work using broad shapes and broad abstract aspects in their paintings. It was not a sense of trying to be like these other guys, because they weren't. They were still painting quite representationally. But there was good theory, and there were many good ideas in this new work, and so an intelligent artist had to look at that and grow from it.
When modernism in the 20s and 30s was declaring itself, these local artists were generally ignored by writers for being too provincial. Several of the Laguna Art Association's 700 members began practicing new art forms, and a conflict arose between the local traditionalists who started the association and modernists who were trying to establish their work. A conflict which remained as a continuing source of debate in the association. David Rosen lived in Los Angeles in the 40s and was considered a radical and avant-garde. The acceptance of one of his works by the LA County Museum of Art made headline news at the time. He eventually moved to Laguna Beach with his wife, Jane Callender, herself an artist.
She had her studio, and she had a lot of young people come up, and she would draw them, paint them. It was a good life. I was downstairs. I was painting. I painted quite a bit. My first painting was a drip, a lacquer drip.
Like Pollock?
Like Pollock. And I submitted it to the Festival of Arts, which we had joined. And I won the first prize of $50, which I later found out that the jury was so sick and tired of seeing the traditional seascapes that they gave it to me. Yeah, I was in the Cicadis workshop in New York, and Jackson Pollock and Philip Guston and about 7 or 8 people that I saw there. I didn't get to know them, but I saw and Cicadas
Muralist.
went to with building floats for the parade, and we worked on that. And I used to see Jackson Pollock arguing with Cicadas.
About? Just in general.
Well, they had his theories. Cicadas told me years later that he thought that Jackson Pollock became great because he saw him drip lacquers, which I saw too. And Cicadas turned out a beautiful painting.
In the 40s, the momentum for modern art continued to build despite resistance by a tradition-bound art world. Artists that fit neither trend found themselves outside the conflict and seemed to prefer it that way. Two of Laguna Beach's early resident contemporary artists, Leonard Kaplan and Andy Wing, lived the struggle of the suburban isolate during the 40s.
How difficult was it to support yourself?
Oh, it never seemed difficult because I had done it ever since I could remember. And the only one who suffered was my ex-wife. She was not used to this kind of life. And to me, it was normal. See?
The life of the artist.
No, I didn't consider myself ever an artist.
What were you?
A survivor
Of?
in this strange world, which is very strange. I still love to put it down on paper, but I do not like living it. See, paper is fine.
Tell me about the service years.
Well, previous to that, I was selling drawings up and down La Cienega 57th Street. It's so similar. And I met this Antoinette Crawshaw of the Crawshaw Galleries, and she was selling my little watercolors and drawings for $18 and $20. And then I joined the Seabees, and I was to make drawings of Army life, but unfortunately I got very ill. And the only time I was able to get up, I got my white pad out, walked toward this Quonset hut, and thought I'd do some drawings of whatever was going on, but it was a prize fight, and one of the contenders ended up not showing up because he had this catarrhal fever, which everyone seemed to get then. And so the prize fighter was, the lieutenant told him to pick someone out of the audience. He saw my white pad and picked me, and unfortunately I was put in the ring with this small killer who proceeded to beat me up until I got him around the head and just removed his scalp. And then the next thing I knew, I was in more or less like an asylum, and with a lieutenant saying that was not the American way to fight. And this kept on until finally they decided that I was not actually a good Army type person.
I moved to Laguna in 1957 and inherited by default a wonderful old building where the Albertsons Market is on Clio Street that had been a movie set in the 30s. It was a Swiss chalet, and the landlord lived upstairs, and he owned this property, very large property that he was attempting to sell to a market chain. And his price of $150,000 or some ridiculous thing, you know, and it sounds like nothing. You can't even buy a house for that now. They wouldn't pay it. So Safeway moved to North Laguna Boat Canyon, and there was this 2-year interim until another chain came along and bought it. So I just lucked into this place because Leonard and Nancy had moved out. They had had their early gallery called Arts and Frames there before mine. So I essentially moved into an empty gallery, and was able to live, paint, and then in the second year, other artists came to town. David Rosen and his wife Jane came to town, and I had met enough of the working artists whose work that I had some respect for, that I had a stable of people that I could show, and I began to conduct life drawing workshops there as well. It brought in a little, pay the rent and so forth.
So it sounds like we had to depend on a network of artists and also on the educational institutions to, and the festival? Did the festival support contemporary arts at all at that time?
The festival did one good thing. and that is that they funded an all-California show, which was a juried show, and occasionally an invitational, open to all living, working artists in California, and mostly they came from Southern California. So that they would get a fairly good juror, fairly knowledgeable juror. So it turned out to be a pretty good show.
The Manoirs spent the years traveling and painting the world in places like Tunis and Saint-Tropez until 1938, when Hazel suffered an attack of tuberculosis. Doctors' recommendations for a better climate encouraged them to remember their Laguna idol and return here to stay, eventually settling in Corona del Mar. Manoir typifies the artist as outsider, traveling the world, then returning to Corona del Mar, where his experiences are distilled through sun and ocean into singular work, sometimes in paint, and, as is often the case with Southern California artists, clay. Manoir used ceramic tile to painstakingly decorate their house with these Byzantine-like murals of a sort of peaceable kingdom on land and under the sea. One of Orange County's first genuine outsider artists, John Searle, made his home in Laguna Beach in the 40s. In midlife and with no formal art training, Searle decided to paint on discarded pieces of cardboard and wood panel. But eventually, Searle, being the epitome of the artist who is fiercely protective of his time and privacy, found his popularity suffocating and chose to isolate himself in a small desert town where he remained until his death in 1993. In stylistic contrast to Searle, but similar in lifestyle, John McLaughlin chose Dana Point and Laguna Beach for the area's isolation. Proximity to the Pacific Rim influenced his sparse, Zen-like paintings. McLaughlin had little regard for the contemporary art developments of the time. He himself remained a suburban isolate in Orange County for most of his artistic life. A close friend and contemporary of John McLaughlin's in San Clemente is Mabel Bennett Hutchinson.
Tell me a little bit about your getting to know John McLaughlin in the 60s.
Well, that was a long story, but I could maybe make it shorter. I met him at the art gallery, which was part of his high school, Newport Beach. So then John said, why were we there? And I said, I had a painting there. And we said, why are you here? And he says, I have a painting. And so we walked over to John's painting, and it was an abstract, beautiful, in blues and grays. It was beautiful abstract, small, it was small. And then we went over to see my watercolor, and he admired it, like a gentleman. So then we said, where do you live? And he said, Dana Point. And he said, oh, we live in Campusnera Beach. We're neighbors. Isn't that wonderful? And they said, yes, we want to get acquainted. And so that is how we met, John.
But he was not a very social person. You were more so, but he stayed out of the
That's right.
activity for the most part.
Yes, he did. And after he began painting the big abstracts, I would call him on the phone for some reason. And Florence would say, oh, he's right in the middle of a field. And he can't leave right now. Wait till he finishes this field.
Oh,
and then he'll
great.
call you back.
Oh, not the kind of field most people would think about. Wasn't it an exhibition that you saw that really inspired you to change from watercolor to the woodworking?
Absolutely.
And
one
who
thing
was that?
leads to another, and one thing leads to another. Went to an exhibit in Los Angeles at the museum, and we wandered into to a little side gallery, and it was the work of Louise Nevelson, and it was all wood, and we had the wood, and we were interested in wood, and Mom says, "You could do better than this."
That's great.
I said, "Yes, I can." And so that started me to, we went home and I couldn't wait till the sun came up so I could start doing wood.
But that had to do with something that you and your husband could enjoy together.
Yes, and I had all the tools and all the materials. The whole environment was perfect for me to leave the watercolors and leave mosaics and go into the wood.
After World War II, a paranoia about communism spread, in part due to propaganda films made by Hollywood's film industry. Extreme reactionism resulted in one of the most painful chapters in United States history, McCarthyism. Political hysteria impacted Rex Brandt, whose painting of a boat at sea with a common mariner's insignia on the sail was interpreted as a communist hammer and sickle. Brandt's efforts to explain the symbol and calm the furor were to no avail, and the controversy raged on. The 50s and 60s saw new art movements developing worldwide. Abstract expressionism, pop, and conceptual art. One of Southern California's emerging and influential young artists was Tony DeLapp. DeLapp's architectural paintings expanded the definitions of the painting surface. In 1969, DeLapp was hired by the just completed Studio Art Department of UC Irvine in Orange County. Those early days set the tone for radical experimentation and created an international reputation for its faculty and students.
UCI in 1965 was a real hot spot for university art department training and so forth, because we were a new school. In a sense, it was a bit of an experiment.
So what kind of students did you attract as a result of hiring that kind of faculty?
Well, we attracted actually students who, many of them, there were not that many in number, but the few that we did attract were students who had been most often at other schools. For example, one of the better known at this date, Jim Terrell, who was one of the very first students, he had been a psychology major at Pomona College. And he had kind of gotten, you know, interested in art and that sort of thing. And he kind of thought, well, I'll take a shot at this, you know, new art department here at UCI. And I remember once I asked him, I said, you know, why did you come here? And he said, well, he said, I didn't really know anything much about individual, you know, professors and so on and so forth. But he said, I kind of looked around, and he said, the older art departments, like UCLA and that kind of thing, he said, they, I don't know, he said, they just seemed kind of too settled and all. And he said, I thought maybe it might be more interesting to have the challenge of a kind of a new sort of different approach.
So it was an experiment for everyone, is what you're saying.
It was an experiment for everybody. Experiment for everybody. And credit has to be given to, in my opinion, credit has to be given to John Copeland's, because John really put UCI on the map. He was a very aggressive, sometimes abrasive, difficult person for some to get along with. But intellectually, I've always thought he was very sound, and I think that he, with his ambition and his drive and his intellectual aggressiveness, I think he really was the guiding light, because he rallied a very interesting group of people in the mid-'60s in Southern California to make all that work, to make the UCI experiment work.
Michael Davis moved to Los Angeles to be closer to the activity that would support his career, yet still maintains ties to Orange County.
Michael, you were really immersed in the alternative gallery scene in the early 70s.
Well, the alternative gallery scene was really an outgrowth between, I think, two schools. One was Cal State Fullerton and one was UCI. And it was really students looking for an alternative situation, I think, away from downtown Los Angeles, where there could be a small center developed of a small core of artists that could show work that normally would not have been exhibited in, let's say, the more commercial gallery spaces.
But the university didn't provide the environment for the exhibition of the same kind of work? Or were there just so many students that they needed space, or they wanted...
Well, the university system was really not showing younger artists at the time, because their mode of working was to try to bring people down to Orange County, and they would think that really they wanted to show more mainstream people into those gallery situations, such as the gallery that Dexter Frankel was developing and Melinda Wart's, the gallery at UCI. So the people that they brought in were more of a national or international basis, even though I think that Cal State Fullerton's direction was more locally based than the artists that were exhibiting at UCI. So we just needed an alternative situation, a place where we could show work that commercially was not viable at that point, and that people wanted to explore new avenues. We were all looking at the art that we were making as very experimental at the time, and that it was breaking new boundaries. It was looking for new directions. It was not a conventional way of making pieces, even though.
Can you describe some of those?
Well, I think it was obvious. I mean, there's the famous shooting arm of Chris Burton that happened in F Space. The gallery that we started, 58F, was started around 1969, when we started to show the work of myself and another gentleman who shared the studio with me, which was Stephen Moore. And out of that outgrowth of just our own interest in bringing down as many of the people who are of importance at that time in Orange County, such as Betty Turnbull, who was involved with the Newport Harbor Art Museum, and Tom Garver, who was involved with Newport Harbor, and Dexter Frankel from Cal State Fullerton. We had a whole entourage of people coming through, even when we were students, which was an interesting phenomena, really, for us and for our studio situation.
In 1965, the California State University at Fullerton opened. Dexter Frankel, museum curator and director of the Museum Studies program for 25 years, reflects upon the school's early accomplishments and its influence today.
But in the very beginning, though, weren't you out in the outback, so to speak, at the campus back in, was it 67 or so, when you first started organizing the program at Cal State Fullerton?
I became gallery director there in 1967, and so I was there a number of years in that capacity. But the classroom was, yes, in the outback, in temporary buildings, which those buildings are still on campus, but they're used for other purposes. And then I had a station wagon, and we would construct props over there and carry them, or use my wagon to take them over to the Commons building on the second floor, and that's where the gallery was.
So you had to slog through the rain and the mud
Exactly.
and the sleet and snow.
I mean, I visualized students carrying these big props and sliding down the hill in the mud and then going upstairs.
Well, how did you learn about this? You were an artist, you started curating. How did you find out about how to construct props and how to do all of that very elaborate work that is what characterizes Dexter Frankel today? Where did you gain that knowledge?
You mean in terms of hands-on?
Hands-on, yes.
Oh, well, that came from always enjoying using tools and being proficient at using them. And I made sculpture, I welded, I did heliarching. I was in a machine shop for about 10 years constructing and working with a heliarcher, and used metal lathes, and just that all came naturally.
Did you have a philosophy about showing or not showing indigenous work, that of Orange County artists?
No, I don't have a prejudice, nor did I, about showing it. I did show local artists, but I did not see the gallery as a space for either emerging artists or local artists or faculty or students.
What, did people agree with you on that, or was there a source of contention?
Somewhat. I felt that, all right, it's Orange County. At that point, they didn't go to Los Angeles much, and so I was able to bring art to them that they could enjoy and perhaps learn about, which otherwise they might not.
During the early 60s, the efforts of women volunteers were the beginnings of the Newport Harbor Art Museum. These women started to mount important exhibitions, such as the work of Morris Graves and Alfred Stieglitz in these modest surroundings. The museum during that time transitioned to a collecting museum of national importance as it moved to its permanent location at Newport Center. Phyllis Lugeons talks about the early days at the museum.
Phyllis, the early days of Newport Harbor Art Museum, the 60s and 70s, were called the audacious years. Tell us why.
Well, I think at that time, the museum was a museum of really avant-garde art. And I think that when it was started, you know, by a group of women who really, they didn't want to go into Los Angeles to see art. That was one of the reasons that they started, people like Betty Winkler and people like Patsy Gibson and Sally Summers. And I think that when they hired their first director, which was Tom Garver, and at that time, that was in 1968, I was hired as their gallery administrator. And that was the first time they had actually two professional people on their staff. And Tom, I think, in some ways was really quite a visionary. The museum's focus was contemporary avant-garde art, and he did incredible shows. And among the shows that he did were things like The Appearing, Disappearing Image Object with Michael Asher and with Barry LeVay and Alan Ruppersberg. Those names were not known the way they are known today. And then he did a Robert Rauschenberg in black and white. He did Tom Wesselman, Early Still Lifes. Betty Turnbull did art of the Northwest Coast Indian and Southwest Coast Indian.
Well, what were people's responses to these kinds of shows in a quote, conservative community like Orange County?
It was amazing. I mean, we had people coming to the shows, obviously, and I'll tell you, the board of directors, or the board at that time, most of which were women, I must say, talking about women in the arts, they were very supportive, and I think that they really trusted us. And I know that in the early days when Tom got in there, I mean, he really had no holds barred. And I think that was the reason why it was called that catalog or that show. When they redid a little bit of each of those shows, was called The Audacious Years. But the main thing is that museum, and I can tell you this from the beginning, never considered themselves a small museum or a non-professional museum. When those women started that museum, they went to advisors, they went to people like Henry Seldes, who was the critic of the LA Times at that time, they went to Jerry Nordland, they went to Jim Demetrian, who was director of the Pasadena Art Museum, they went to Sterling Holloway, who was an incredible collector of contemporary, and they got information on kind of how to do it. And when they wanted to organize shows, when they were totally volunteers.
But this was a very modest setting too, of course, we're talking about.
It was a very modest setting, but in the same analysis, they had indoctrinated the board to have catalogs, you know. I mean, you know, we know that there are some directors that feel that catalogs are more important than the exhibitions, because that's what's left after the shows are over. And so that, you know, even though it was small scale, it was like a little jewel. And in some ways, even as it moved, it was still a little jewel, because it's certainly not a big museum. Even today, it's not a big museum.
Paul Schimmel was hired by the Newport Harbor Museum after a series of changes in administration during the late 70s. Schimmel organized daring exhibitions that earned the museum an international reputation, initiating the California Artist Series and acquiring work by Orange County artists for the museum's permanent collection.
Paul, the 60s and 70s were called the audacious years, but I think that the years that you were there were the audacious years. Did you bring that kind of spirit to the museum on purpose?
When one really looks at the history of the exhibitions over 8 years, I think some of the most memorable shows are not necessarily, quote, risque. And I think if, in fact, you look at it kind of analytically, the combination, the balance between different shows, you'll see that probably less than 10 or 15% of the total show would you kind of characterize as risque. I think, on the other hand, they were shows that demanded, or at least accepted, the intelligence of the audience. I don't think these kinds of serious scholarly exhibitions concerned with Bay Area figuration, the New York School abstract painters in the 50s, late surrealist art from Paris and its relationship to the emergence of abstract expressionism, a show about the Flemish symbolist and expressionists, Edvard Munch's expressionist period. I mean, and there's New York School sculpture organized by the Whitney. These are very highly focused, extremely scholarly, at least in intent. Not that the results were always perfectly successful, but intention. They were not, I think, pandering. They had nothing to do with a, quote, perceived need within the community to have beautiful or uplifting necessarily. They were sort of serious art historical issues and questions, and things I think you could have, quite frankly, equally asked in institutions in other parts of the country, or the world for that matter.
After 30 years in Orange County, artist and educator Nixon Bora left for the mainstream of Los Angeles.
Well, I moved to LA for a variety of reasons, some of them personal. I needed to get away for a while, but the main reason was my art career, I felt, could not go any further in Orange County. I was seriously committed to studio work. I was paying a lot to have a major space to work in, and I was convinced after Art Connections that I would never get anybody, any art dealers, any art collectors of any significance to come and look at what I was doing. So it seemed clear to me that I needed to move into Los Angeles. In fact, I was seriously considering going to New York. So I got a loft downtown in LA, and some of those things did in fact happen. But more importantly, I think for me, was that my life got better, I felt. Living in Orange County, I found that I did not go to Los Angeles as often as I wanted to. It seemed too difficult. Now I drive home, and once I'm home, I've only got 10 or 15 minutes to go to the lectures and the films and the performance art pieces and so forth that I really enrich my work. My work depends upon that kind of artistic excitement in a lot of diverse fields, and it's very difficult to find in Orange County. More than that, I think after 25 years of living in Orange County, in a very quiet and wonderful community that has a lot of cultural activities, I nevertheless felt that art is fundamentally about taking risks, about valuing diversity and taking chances, and I think suburbia is precisely not about those things. Suburbia is a middle-class nirvana. It's the place where risks are banished. Everything is safe and secure. It conforms to what's considered normal, and I think that's incompatible with an art-making energy. People, you know, poor people take risks because they have to. They have no choice. Rich people take them because they're bored and they haven't got anything to lose. But middle-class people don't take risks. That's the essence of being in the middle class. And that's what suburbia is all about, is getting away from insecurity.
In 1973, the BC Space Gallery was started by Jerry Birchfield and Mark Chamberlain, serving first as an early venue for the exhibition of photography and later as an important alternative exhibition site for local artists.
I was new to Laguna, even though I'd basically grown up in Orange County, but the regular festival wasn't showing photography then, and so this was a way that to introduce photography to the festival again. They'd shown it years ago and then decided it wasn't legitimate enough of an art to show.
So how did that evolve into BC Space Photography as a business from its very modest beginnings, I assume?
Well, Jerry was doing, we were both doing commercial work in photography, and Jerry was a student as well, and I was painting houses to keep body and soul together with the long-term ambition, actually having come to California from Iowa via the U.S. Army with the goal of starting a gallery for photography, and big ambitions, but you know, it happened ultimately. But one of my commercial clients expressed an interest in would I be able to do some of their lab services. And so I called Jerry with some areas that I wasn't real keen on. I was decent with photography in black and white, and I called Jerry, and he told me that he was the reigning expert on color printing, and which is what they needed. So I told him yes, we could do that, and I asked him if he would be interested in such an enterprise, and everything that I didn't know, he did, and he assumed. We both assumed that the other knew about 10 times.
And you were kind of lying to each other. That's what
We've been lying to each other ever since. That's true.
Theoretically, Mark had this MBA in business background, and I had a photography background because I've been working commercially for quite a few years, but I had a very little interest in commercial photography, mainly in terms of the fine arts and going my own direction with it. And we just sort of meshed personality-wise, and that developed into creating a business opportunity where we could have the freedom to do what we wanted rather than working for somebody else.
During the 1970s, 5 alternative spaces were active simultaneously. Michael Davis and Richard Turner participated in alternative spaces during these days. Turner found Orange County a rich source of inspiration for his work.
Richard, Chapman College and the Guggenheim Gallery has had a tremendous influence on artists in the art scene in Orange County. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I started directing the gallery at Chapman in 1973, and the kinds of things that I've been interested in have been primarily oriented towards the local art scene. That's been in part a matter of a low budget, but mainly as a matter of just personal interest. I believe in supporting the local art scene. So most of our shows have been drawn from Orange County or the surrounding area.
But what about a young artist that lives in Orange County that wants to be part of the traditional gallery system? Would you suggest that a young artist move out of Orange County, or can they, function here for...
I think moving out of Orange County is one thing that they could do. In some ways, I'd say, yeah, that's the easiest thing to do. But what I would much rather see is the young artist in Orange County staying here and starting these art communities that I myself didn't start.
Well, what keeps you here in Orange County? It's a suburban community of a major metropolitan art center.
Well, first of all, I think I stay here because I'm basically a suburbanite at heart. I've liked living in big cities, but I come from the country, and so it's, I don't know, a natural compromise. I like the big city, but being in the suburbs is more to my nature. I'm somewhat of a loner, I guess. But more importantly, Orange County has this incredible population of Asian cultures here, and that's what feeds my art. That's what feeds all of my major interests. I teach Asian art history, so it's right here on your doorstep. The Pacific Rim is right here in Southern California. We've got Little Saigon. We've got the largest population of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam. We've got a Korean area, major Cambodian community in Long Beach, and it's just something that is, it's my material. It's what I care about, and I don't want to move.
Regardless of geography, when they are in those private, creative moments, artists create and are created by the places they live in, and to a certain extent are always outside the mainstream.
Well, a lot of people got really interested in it and kind of decided to take a couple or so off, so it used to be more full.
Like where on the animal's eyes and stuff like that?
Yeah, they take off the animal's eyes right here. There used to be all diamonds in there. They weren't real. A lot of this little, like, mother of pearl kind of looks like. They took a lot off of there, too.
Irving Manoir continued to paint and make his ceramics and travel with his wife until his death in 1982. People still come by to visit the tile house that he built, some just curious onlookers. Some perhaps are making a pilgrimage of sorts, paying their respects to a monument to creativity.